The following program is brought to you by democracyatwork.info. Broadcasting from a U.S. colony, my name is Andrew Mercado Vasquez, and this is Puerto Rico Forward, a program that takes a look at the economic and legal structures at play between the United States of North America and Puerto Rico. On the last episode, I provided a general overview on how Puerto Rico's status issue could finally be addressed and resolved, and I encourage you to take a listen if you haven't done so already. As stated there, the most important element in the development of a non-colonial political status for Puerto Rico is the element of sovereignty. Loosely defined, sovereignty is a supreme power that emanates from an autonomous state over a body politic. Today, I'll discuss a specific instance where the U.S. manifested beyond a shadow of a doubt that U.S. sovereignty reigns over the archipelago and shapes its future. Now, although many thoughts might come to mind when reflecting upon William J. Clinton's presidency throughout the 90s, two words always come racing to my consciousness: task force. And I'll explain. On December 23rd of the year 2000, President Clinton signed Executive Order 1318-3, titled Establishment of the President's Task Force on Puerto Rico's Status. Section 1 established the general policy of the U.S. government towards Puerto Rico's status issue, and I quote, "It is the policy of the executive branch of the government of the United States of America to help answer the questions that the people of Puerto Rico have asked for years regarding the options for the island's future status and the process for realizing an option. Further, it is our policy to consider and develop positions on proposals, without preference among the options, for the Commonwealth's future status, to discuss such proposals with representatives of the people of Puerto Rico and the Congress, to work with leaders of the Commonwealth and the Congress to clarify the options, to enable Puerto Ricans to determine their preference among options for the island's future status that are not incompatible with the Constitution and basic laws and policies of the United States, and to implement such an option if chosen by a majority, including helping Puerto Ricans obtain a governing arrangement under which they would vote for national government officials if they choose such a status." End of quote. Equally important, Section 3 of the Executive Order states that the task force would have the following functions, and I quote, "The task force shall seek to implement the policies set forth in Section 1 of this order. It shall ensure official attention to and facilitate action on matters related to proposals for Puerto Rico's status and the process by which an option can be realized. It shall provide advice and recommendations on such matters to the President and the Congress." End of quote. Now, it actually took 5 years for this task force, this presidential task force, to finally squeeze out a tiny 10-page report on December of 2005. And although only half of those pages have any real use at all, they contain some of the most honest words the U.S. government has ever written on the Puerto Rico subject. For example, while discussing the option of statehood, the task force declares the following, and again I quote, "Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory, which means that it is not intended to become a state. It therefore is subject only to the most fundamental provisions of the U.S. Constitution. As part of the process of becoming a state, a territory becomes incorporated into the United States by Congress." End of quote. Now, as mentioned in the past episode, in the last episode, statehood and independence are the only status options that truly allow Puerto Rico to regain its sovereignty. And actually, the task force itself admits this when, on page 10 of its report, it asserts the following, I quote, "Although the current territorial status may continue so long as Congress desires, there are only 2 non-territorial options recognized by the U.S. Constitution that establish a permanent status between the people of Puerto Rico and the government of the United States. One is statehood, the other is independence." End of quote. As we can observe, the task force is openly stating that Puerto Rico's statehood option already has a pre-established roadblock. You see, by being an unincorporated territory, Puerto Rico does not have a clear path toward eventual statehood. In fact, Puerto Rico's current status means that statehood is not a viable option. Of course, this does not mean that Puerto Rican statehood is impossible, but rather that it would require Puerto Rico to become an incorporated territory. Now, that said, I really can't imagine anything that could stop the U.S. from admitting an unincorporated territory as a state. After all, Congress has the constitutional power to do so and plenary power over its territories. Also, it's worth pointing out that the task force explicitly asserts that the current status, colonialism, can go on forever if Congress so wants it. And one can only wonder why Congress could possibly desire Puerto Rico's status issue to be perpetually unsolved. Well, although I can't read minds, I could guess it has something to do with economics, or more specifically, money. Generally speaking, a colonial relationship will usually entail a certain level of perceived dependence. In the case of Puerto Rico, one could conclude that it's a great example of dependency theory at work. Said theory basically describes the notion that resources flow from a poor and underdeveloped group of people, usually in the form of a state, to a wealthy one, provoking the enrichment of the latter at the expense of the former. Now, I won't get into the details of this economic theory, but if you are interested in learning more, the writings of Andre Gunter Frank should be your starting point. Now, you might be asking yourself why I would think that this theory applies to Puerto Rico and helps understand Congress's possible desire to maintain its current colonial status. Now, the answer comes in the form of a study made by Rosario Rivera Negron, a Puerto Rican economist and professor at the University of Puerto Rico at Calley. Put simply, what Professor Rivera Negron did was compare the money coming to Puerto Rico from the U.S. to the money leaving Puerto Rico to the U.S. Let's break down both categories. In the first category, we have federal assistance programs like Pell Grants and Medicaid, which total to about $1.9 billion. We also have government funding, which totals to about $3 billion. And lastly, we have federal programs funded by employment and payroll taxes like Social Security and unemployment. That adds up to $8.9 billion. Now, all three of those numbers in sum give a result of $13.8 billion. Now, it's important to point out that this last group of federal programs funded by employment and payroll taxes is actually financed by our own tax dollars. So the benefits received by them are not a gift, they're owed. In the second category, we're talking about the money that actually leaves Puerto Rico to the U.S. Now there we have, first off, U.S. imports, which total to about $22.6 billion. We also have profits generated by U.S. corporations, which totals to about $34 billion. And lastly, we have cabotage fees, which add up to $1.5 billion. Now, all those numbers add up to $58.1 billion. And when you compare to the first group, the difference is $44.3 billion in favor of the U.S. Oh, and I actually forgot to mention, this is only for the year 2008. So in just 1 year, the U.S. is able to extract from Puerto Rico $44.3 billion. Now, right there, ladies and gentlemen, is the naked truth in numbers. The answer to why the U.S. would allow Puerto Rico to continue its current colonial status can be summed up in just one small word: profit. Quite simply, colonialism is great business for the colonial owner, the master. And we're not even talking about the lobbying efforts that happen in Congress by these huge corporations that suck out $34 billion in profits from Puerto Rico. Now, that said, let's continue looking at the task force's report to see what else we can find, what other wonderful little gifts this task force gave us in 2005. After briefly touching on the subject of statehood, as a status option for Puerto Rico, the task force moves on to provide an equally transient discussion on independence. The task force begins its discussion by insisting on its power over the archipelago, and again, I quote, "As already discussed, Congress's power under the U.S. Constitution's Territory Clause does include the power to relinquish all of its sovereignty over a territory. Congress thus may determine whether and upon what conditions a territory may receive independence, and its authority to regulate those conditions remains until the point of independence." End of quote. This passage really doesn't require further explanation. It quite simply states that it would be Congress who decides how and when Puerto Rico will be granted its independence. Now, the only useful portion of the task force's discussion on independence is when it describes the free associated state model of independence. Under it, two sovereign states negotiate and approve compacts of free association. Under such an arrangement, the free associated state would be able to conduct its own foreign relations while maintaining close financial and security ties with the nation-state it is associated with. However, this arrangement can be unilaterally terminated. As a result, at any moment, the compact can be terminated, jeopardizing whatever economic or legal structures that relied on said relationship. It does not take much reflection to realize that such an arrangement would do little to avoid a skewed relationship. A good example of this model in action would be the bond that currently exists between the Republic of the Marshall Islands and the U.S. The U.S. Census Bureau reported that in the year 2017, total exports from the U.S. to the Republic of the Marshall Islands was about $574 million. However, imports from the Republic of the Marshall Islands to the U.S. that same year amounted to a minuscule $36 million. The numbers speak for themselves. Now, obviously, the task force had no qualms when it came to clearly avowing the U.S.'s power over Puerto Rico, but it seems like that wasn't enough. Its members decided to venture into a truly vulgar display of power by writing the following, and one last time, I quote, "The federal government may relinquish United States sovereignty by granting independence or ceding the territory to another nation." End of quote. Now, in case you missed it, what this means in plain English is that Congress, if it felt like it, could simply give Puerto Rico away. I would like to take just a second to let that sink in. You see, throughout this program, I've stated again and again that Puerto Rico is a property of the U.S., a thing to be used in the interest of its colonial master. And I suppose some of you might have thought I was being dramatic. After all, it seems a bit fantastic to suppose that in this day and age, such an unchecked power still exists. One might think this should be a thing of the past. Being able to dispose of an entire people in any way it sees fit might appear to be a power granted to a greedy king or an evil emperor. But nonetheless, it exists and belongs to the body that governs a nation that champions itself as a defender of freedom and democracy. A nation that looks down at other countries as soon as the slightest demonstration of abuse arises. That nation, the great United States of America, almost 13 years ago, decided it could give me away. Through the task force's 2005 report, we can observe a near absolute power at play, reminiscent of the times of slavery when human beings could be bought and sold like cattle. I guess the task force saw the world as nothing but a big U.S. plantation, and the day Puerto Ricans stop being useful will be sold off or given away. And that's not a hyperbole. Now, if you found today's episode useful, if you found it informative, please consider sharing it so other people become aware of the Puerto Rico issue and can help us solve it. Now remember, you can look us up on Patreon so you can help us continue moving this program forward. Look us up on iTunes and Google Play. As always, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Y que viva Puerto Rico.